This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
What's it like writing for games? Let's just start with that.
It's a lot of work. It's also a lot of chaotic work. I think, having written in more traditional forms, it's often very quiet and plotting. And game writing is constantly active. You're always interfacing with a lot of people, juggling a lot of different concerns. It's not, when I was doing my education is in creative writing, and so when I was working on my novels or my stories, I would spend huge chunks of my day pacing back and forth in my house, in like my house coat, drinking coffee, and then would sit down for hours at a stretch writing, and then pace, and then write and pace, and entire days would disappear like that. But writing for games, you don't stop like talking to people. Like the writing part just gets squished into whatever spare minute you can find.
That is consistent with my experience as well. I was a novelist previously. I've written for theater, I've written for marketing, and game writing is by far the most collaborative process I've been involved with. Just an amazing number and variety of people contribute to the process and to the stories. I like to think that writers write a script, but it's the team that creates the story. And so we share credit and responsibility for whatever the result is.
And I tend to totally agree with that. I mean, I'm slightly different to the other guys here in that I tend to be predominantly the producer role, and then with a second hat on as writing as well. And the two projects we've done most recently, or the two that I was talking about today, one is for Sherlock, the BBC crime drama, which you might know, which was a really intense writing experience because you're working with such awesome TV writers, and we had to adapt that into an interactive narrative, which was fascinating. And then the other one, which is mentioned in the program, which I'd be surprised if anyone's heard of because we haven't announced it yet. This was announced formally here, called The Suspect, which is a psycho thriller where you're in conversation with this psycho, and writing for that has been a real challenge. We have 3 writers on it, myself included, and it's not like we all 3 of us get together. We bring in one writer with one specific skill set at one moment in the production, and then they pass on the writing to another one, who passes on the writing to another one, because technically it's so new.
There's so many different types of games, from AAA to indie to... When you get a big project, when you go, okay, here's our new project, how are we going to write this? What kind of process do you go through in those initial stages, and how complicated is that, and how challenging is that?
I find it starts with a lot of meetings. You sit down with your game designers and level designers, creative director, anyone else who has a big stake in it, maybe the art director, and everybody discusses what it is that they hope that the game will be, and you start to work out how the writing will contribute to that, how the game design will contribute to that, and sometimes you sort of separate and work on your own thing, come back together, rearrange it a bit, and it's a real back and forth process from the beginning. There's never a moment where you sit down and think, I'm the writer and I'm going to define exactly what this game story is, and I'm going to go off in a place and pace with my coffee and come up with my own story. It's always something that you're developing together. I think ideally, I know it doesn't always work like that, but I'm happy to say that that's how we do it on Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, I think like in game writing, in film writing or novel writing or stage writing or whatever, you sit down and write your screenplay. You don't ever say, how am I going to structure the concept of a screenplay? Whereas when you sit down to write a game, every time you're writing a game, one game is as different from another as screenwriting is from poetry, right? It's completely different. There's no standardized approach to writing a game story. So you're always reinventing the wheel every time you sit down to, so your first conversations aren't what's the story about, or who are the characters, or where's the game set, or like whatever. The first conversations are, how is story gonna work in this game? Like how is it gonna operate and execute? And like how is it gonna be creatively a part of the cohesive whole. Now, you may also talk about characters and story, like all that's part of it, but the more important questions are like, how does it function as a component of this game, which is just not a question you ask about stage writing or novel writing or anything like that.
And that's the most fun bit, I think, is that this is the most, I would say, the most innovative part of writing, across all different media at the moment, because it's changing so fast. If you're writing for a book, you know what you're writing. If you're writing for a screenplay, you know what you're writing. Writing for a game, is it a mobile game? Is it an online? Is it a role-playing game? Is it a multiplayer game? Is it a single-player game? Is it Angry Birds? Which I always said actually conforms to a sort of Shakespearean way of writing. It's complete 3 acts. I don't think they designed it like that, But
you don't even know if there will be dialogue, if there will be a script. Some people are forced to write in Excel.
Tell us about that. How do you write in Excel?
Oh, I don't know. We fortunately don't have to do that.
Well, I'll tell you what we're doing on the Suspect at the moment is we're writing to mind mapping software. Yeah. Because each individual piece of the conversation then has to have characteristics around it. Like if they say, something good or something exciting, score this amount of points, move them forward in this particular status and trigger all these other events that have to happen. So each piece has its own, it's almost like the writing is coding it as well. And then the coders, formalize it.
It really is, I was just going to say, it's like a logic puzzle a lot of the time. I used to do web code, and I find that I access similar parts of my mind or my thinking process when I'm trying to figure out how to solve narrative issues with games. And often the writer is the only person who can really see the full picture of this is what we have to accomplish, and we still want the characters to speak like real people. We don't want to sacrifice any drama in the service of the gameplay. And so the writer is often the person who can sort of like sort the Rubik's Cube out to figure out how to get all of those things happening at the same time.
It's interesting that you say writing without words. It's what kind of challenges involve in trying to write a scene where you actually don't have any dialogue, but you need to, get those messages across in a game, which is, I imagine, a lot harder than just being able to say this is what's meant to happen in this scene. You know what I mean? Like what kind of skills do you need to be able to write without words, to be able to get your message across in a game?
There's a neat mental trick that Darby McDevitt, who wrote the main story for Assassin's Creed 4, likes to remind people that the game design has all your verbs. So what your character can do and where the story can go is shaped by what the player can literally do with the controller. I've totally lost track of the original question.
Sorry, I had a question there somewhere. Sorry, it was a bit messy, but
it was about
like how. What kind of skills do you need to be able to get your story across without being able to say the words? Like writing a scene.
Well, I think this is actually true for all forms of writing. A good piece of TV or theater will, action expresses hopefully as much as dialogue, and what's not said in dialogue is often as important as what is said. So I think it's still important with games, even though you do have to have great people skills because you're working with so many people. You also have to have just really solid basic writing skills.
So games it sounds like they're a much more collaborative, a collaborative writer in games, whereas if you're writing for other mediums, for books or film, right, you would do a lot of that initially on your own. So people skills are very important when writing for games.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously film and television writing are extremely collaborative, especially once you're on set, right? The screenwriter, often not the person who wrote the original screenplay. It's maybe a bunch of people who are in to, help do rewrites and change things. And, this actor doesn't like the way these lines are working, so he's working with the director to rebuild the scene. And you're kind of there as a writer might be there as kind of a service to them to help them tighten that scene up and change it. And so that's a very dynamic process, but it's still based on the idea that at one point there was a screenplay that then got pushed into development and into production, and then you're executing on that. Whereas in a game, I suppose probably there are some games that start with a story, but not I don't see it often being used as a roadmap into development.
Yeah,
like
I
the
think
writer's
maybe
constantly involved.
it's more like the story can suggest things to inspire the designers. But once the designers are inspired, you have to let go of whatever that original idea was, and then in turn take inspiration back from what they've done with it.
Is there an example of something that you've written that you're really proud of, and everything just worked really well? And what was it, and how did that come to be?
Yes. I'm most proud of the projects that are difficult and that came out well despite how tough they were. And for the last few years, I've actually been working with teams that are even not in my city. So I was working in Montreal, and I was working with Ubisoft Sofia in Bulgaria over an 8-hour time difference and a language barrier. And to be able to sort of figure out what everybody wanted and what the players needed, and create something really interesting and compelling, and that people love as much as they loved Evelyn in Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation. That's the kind of thing I'm proud of. And I don't know what it would look like if everything just went well. I don't know what that would be. It seems almost impossible. I mean, even if you get a group of friends together for dinner, at some point there might be some amount of conflict. You just can't agree with everyone all the time, and it's more interesting, I think, in how we sort things out together than things working. I guess that's why that's one aspect of games being art, is the humanities aspect of actually making them.
There's another piece I find interesting here, which is when we do predominantly work on mobile platforms, which is a very fluid platform, and you put the game out, and then 2 weeks later you'll do an update, and then a week after that you'll do an update. And seeing the feedback from those players on the story means that the writer, traditionally the writer might come into a project and then stop, and then it passes over, and then the gold disc master is out there, and we're finding that the writer is now an ongoing part of our team, and we'll keep making updates based on what the players feedback, whether they like a particular bit of the storyline, or they find a level too easy or level too hard. It's often those rewrites which the players love as well, because they feel that they're part of the whole process, which is again different to every or a lot of sort of traditional boxed product games or books or movies where it's out there and it's done.
So it sounds like it's quite different writing now than it was maybe 10 years ago because of the technology with games and how that's changing and being more interactive. And where do you see?
I'm not sure. I don't think it's that it's different now. I think it's always been there because we've always had the new medium there. So the internet has, always been, not always been there, since 1969. But I mean, take it 10 years ago. People have always been experimenting with this. But I guess what's changed in 10 years is we've had 10 years more experience of doing it. And it just takes time for people to grow up and experiment and try new stuff.
Is it exciting writing for games? Is it an exciting job to have? And do you see the role of the writer becoming more and more important as story becomes more important in games?
I think those are two really different questions.
Yeah. I think
so take the first one first. Is it exciting? So, like when I was in, again, my education's in creative writing, and when I was, doing my fiction classes and my short story classes and my poetry classes and like trying to figure all that out, I was kind of like, I don't feel like, I was writing what would be called very experimental fiction, and I mean, this is in the 90s, so it wasn't even like I had an email account at the time. So the internet was still very, as we understand it today, it was very nascent. But I always had this desire to do things that were new and experimental and hadn't been done before. And I felt, I had these big, like maybe I don't actually want to be a writer because I don't feel like there's much that I can do formally, I mean, structurally, that hasn't been done before. Even the stuff I was doing in school that I thought was brilliant and really experimental, my instructors would be like, oh, well, have you read, this book by this guy from 1963? And I'd go find out what it was and be like, oh, well, great idea that I had got done 40 years ago, whatever. But then once I got into games, I was like, oh, I get it. Like, I get to invent That was what I was saying. Like, I get to invent every single thing that I'm doing every single day, like absolutely creating out of whole cloth. And yeah, it's fascinating. It feels really, really good to do stuff that no one ever imagined before.
I think games are still creating genres, aren't they? It must be exciting when we get games which have all those different types of threads, you know? So it's not just a conversation is going to play out this way. So you have different conversation options and stuff like that when the character that the gamer is playing is changing the story as it goes. What's that like to write for when you can't count on what the player is going to do?
I mean, you write for the system space, right? It's game design as much as it is writing. You're writing for coverage of all of the possibility. It's like, imagine if you're making a film but you don't control the camera, so you need to make sure that you know that you're acting in 360 degrees and whatever, so the camera can be anywhere. Like, that's just a rough example. Like she was saying, you know, and Guy was saying as well, like, a lot of your writing is heavily embedded in code. It might be written in spreadsheets or in different mind mapping software, or all kinds of different tools that you're using to try and describe the story. I think that myself and the narrative designer and a couple other people probably spent the better part of a year building the infrastructure for how the story in Far Cry 2 would work. Down to the point where when we handed it off to writers, they had literally hundreds of pages of spreadsheets and different pieces of software, and it was like, in this conversation, which is 3 sentences long, this character says to this character that they need to do this and talk about, and it's just like, now you have to fill in the blanks. Give us like 200,000 words. We'll see you in 3 months. Like, you know, so all of the structural engineering of the story was done, and what got handed off to the writers was you know, unfortunately, was fill in the blanks, because so much of what we were doing was about describing the possibility space that the player could move around in, and the actual writing of the dialogue was just in service of that, in a sense. So it was really different from anything else.
There's a structure that was probably written about in a book in 1960, but we just thought about it, which is that you've always got to have the spine of the story. So the story, I'd argue, still needs to move from A to B to C, because you're moving people on, and it's got to have some element of pace, because pace creates tension, and tension creates emotion in some ways. So we always have this theory, to your point, about conversation. You know, how do you, the question that we always wrestle with is, how do you create pace when it's constantly being interrupted by interactivity? It's like this complete conundrum. So one of the ways we looked at it was like a sort of a book on a book spine, where you've got the pace, the structure running down the center, but that the player can fall off it at any point. And they don't necessarily know when they've fallen off it. But that's the dialogue that you're then writing for. You're writing for a dialogue that is still edgy and has that pace and tension, but is also starting to pull them back into the spine a little bit. And especially in those conversational moments where, you know, and again, if it happens to be AI or whatever it is, you've got a conversation where the player's asking about, you know, what food they like. Well, that's completely off topic unless it's a MasterChef game. But if it, you know, in that space, you've got to then cater for it, because you don't want the player to feel that they're being pushed back. But you sort of code in these loops, and that say if they've spent too much time off the spine of the main story, then start to pull them back into the main spine. So, you know, I know what you're saying, but hey, we've got a mission here, and then you pull them back into that, and that then brings that tension back. So it's you know, that's how we tend to look at when we're talking to writers and we're writing for this stuff. That's how we pull it back.
Whenever I'm playing a game and I have a character come up to me and say something like, "Hey, did you hear about this thing over there?" I'm like, "I'm busy. I'll get to it in a minute." To that point, I often find yes, that can be quite stressful.
You've got to be really careful, because that jars, right? You can't have the gears crunching, and so it's how you write. It's the how you write that. You know, the theory is great. The what is sort of easy to talk about. The how is where the art is.
Do you think? I'm sorry, we can continue.
I was just going to say that one way that I think about it is you can't know exactly what a player is going to do, but you know what your system is, and you can look at it as one of the roles of story is to help draw the player into the system and show them the results of interacting with it. And that kind of can permit more open-ended stories that relate more to how the player is playing. But that was interesting about the spine. I think there's a way to put those two ideas together.
Yeah, I mean it's a tricky one, because I do think, you know, the concept of when I first started out doing all this stuff, there was this concept of interactive fiction, and I remember just sitting back thinking, well, those two words don't work together. How do you resolve that? And it's been, you know, a life's obsession ever since.
I think you have to kind of know what the options are and then be willing to give up a bit of the control and trust that if the player chooses not to have a particular moment, then great, that was their decision. You can't be as much of a control freak about being like, now you will cry. You know?
And that's the fun, that's the power, right? I mean, you know, the other thing we talk about often is that, you know, and it's a contentious point, especially to be made at a writers' festival, but, you know, a lot of, if you're writing a book, it becomes a monologue. It's the monologue from the writer to the reader. In what we do, it's a dialogue. And there is feedback that comes back, and how we handle that as writers actually makes it a lot more intense. And you can go back before books, go back to storytelling, and, you know, the examples I give is, you know, if you're telling a story to a kid, and you know, at bedtime, and you're saying, oh, you know, there was a horse, it was galloping down the beach, and the kid's going to interrupt, saying, what colour was the horse? White. Why was it white? Now you're off the spine, but you've got to come back. But that moment where it becomes that dialogue, there's an intensity of the experience that I think is new. That's what excites me. That I think that what we're able to do in this new medium is sort of go back. Funnily enough, we go back over the books and back into those oral tradition.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, it is an extension of oral tradition more than it's an extension of sort of top-down authored, like you know, directed meaning that we've grown accustomed to, particularly over the last 100 years or so, with the explosion of film as kind of like the cultural touchstone for everybody. But, you know, for thousands of years, like literally no one was literate. All storytelling was, you know, some guy sitting around playing a mandolin or something, and talking about, you know, what was happening between the families that lived in the hills on the other side, and people interjecting, and that person taking people's questions while they're telling some classical story that's been handed down for generations, and adapting it and evolving it. And, you know, that's sort of the oral tradition, and dialogous meaning is what I call it, and we're in that role. That we are those kinds of storytellers with players, except that we're not in a real-time communication. So we have to author the system that acts as though we are the bard or the minstrel sitting there telling the story and responding to the player asking, you know, what color is the horse? Can we go kill a dragon now? And it's like, how do I get a dragon into this story? And you have to like. And then bring it back onto the story that I'm trying to tell after we deal with the dragon expediently. But it's just that we have to, you know, humans are smart and computers are really, really dumb. So we have to spend a lot of energy making the computer try to do a not terrible job of bringing the player back onto the main spine, I think you called it.
The other little rule that we tend to use is, what's this going to play like if one person's playing, and what's it going to play like if a million people are playing? You know, they're the same experience, and does it work? So your point, you know, if you might think, oh, that's easy, okay, so we get a writer, we just stick him in front of a computer and he can answer all the users' questions. Great if there's one player, more challenging for a million.
Well, we used to joke like, oh, we could do this and this and this and this in the game, and I was like, that's great, but we're not going to be able to ship like 3 million copies of you. Yeah. So we need to find a way to formalize it in order to make it work. So
it's interesting how wearing a hot dog suit throughout an entire game can change the way cutscenes play out, such as in the Saints Row series. What I love about the way games stories and writing is developing in the last few years especially is it's playing with really dangerous and interesting and exciting emotions. You know, I'm finding myself crying more in games than ever before, and loving characters in games more than I've loved in any other kind of medium. Do you think we're just at the tip of the iceberg with what we can do with story in games and writing for games?
Yeah, it feels like a kind of like a frontier town. Yeah, and the smallest, most obvious gesture you can think of can be received like just the hugest splash. Like just deciding to address the theme of slavery for many people was seen as extreme. I get so many interview questions asking like, were you nervous because it was risky? And for us, it's like, well, books and film and every other media tackles all kinds of themes and subjects and uses it to come up with interesting things and explore the human condition. And games actually have even, I think, more of a capacity to do that for the way that you put the player into the game and demand that the player interact with it directly. So yeah, there's tons still to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are increasingly open to the idea that, games aren't just kind of like disposable entertainment for children anymore, that games can be sophisticated and can speak to more important subject matters and can deal with things in a responsible and intelligent way and respectful way that also looks at problems and issues and real things in a way that's different from how other media do it. And this is the real value of games, right? It's a new lens for us to look at the human condition, for lack of a better word. But I mean, there's no question, working on Splinter Cell, for years, which is ostensibly a game about, U.S. commandos exporting, American justice into, third world and developing nations in violation of international law, like absolutely. And it's just kind of like, these are pretty serious themes and they were hard to handle, but between 2002 and 2003, 2004, we were working on that, and then working on Far Cry, things got a lot more sophisticated. I mean, this was a game that tried to not glamorize and make fun out of a civil war in a failed African state, and like the kinds of problems that are implicit in that, and to try and comment on it in a way that people don't find offensive. But I mean, we had to have a lot of very long, serious conversations about like, hey, like, are people gonna be able to recognize that this isn't just, making it fun to run around Africa with an AK-47 and blow people away? Like, that's not really a cool thing. That's not fun. But we can make movies about that. We can make novels about that. We can write songs about it. Like, so we need to also be able to make games about it so that we can, earn our seat at the table of culture. And so that's, I think that's starting to happen more and more, and I think it's great.
On that note, I think maybe it might be time to go for questions. Forgive me, I don't know how to watch. Let me just check my phone here. Yeah, I think we should move on to some questions from the audience. So please, there will be a microphone going around. Raise your hand, and when you want to ask your question, please make sure you stand up to ask the question as well.
What's it like writing a game with a lead protagonist who has like a personality and character arc and everything, but is also the player?
I think the point of view is important if you're writing a first-person shooter. The personality of the player will tend to sort of, not of the player, of the character will sort of tend to be pushed to the sides, and those characters tend to be almost just like vessels where the player can sort of insert themselves. With a third-person game, you have sort of a stronger layer of personality for the character, but quite often we're still trying to create characters that the player will want to identify with or will feel sort of inspired or pumped up by playing. So there's a balancing act between leaving room for the player, but also creating strong enough character that is interesting and it shows you something about the game world that you're going into.
Some down the front here as well.
I think maybe Guy, this might be a question for you.
Thank you.
So you guys are talking about how you're not you have to start not with the story, but with a more structural kind of element. But then, what do you do if you're handed a text, like your pre-established story, for example, like Sherlock? then where do you go from there? Like, how do you write the game around that?
Great question. I mean, Sherlock was fascinating because there's a whole canon there. I mean, going way back to the original thing, but also we had to remain incredible. Oh gosh, how do I do this quickly? Let's start with the fans. Sherlock fans, we knew that if we got it wrong, you know, and you know, there were a couple of key decisions on that project. One, we felt that we wanted to use Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman as the actors, and we brought them into the whole experience. That was important. Two, we felt that by immersing the player and getting him into Sherlock's homeless network, we could. That was the sort of diving under the water bit. That was how we then created the interactive experience, and that you're working for Sherlock. So that's how it dived down. And then three, we felt, and I don't mean this in any sort of pat on the back way, but we felt confident enough in the brand of Sherlock, the actors, and what we were producing to charge for it on a mobile thing. And just say honest, you know, hands up, we think, and in Australia it's $5.99. It's a high price point. We've had no complaints about that price point. And it was, I'd tell you, it was a confidence that was like 100% confidence and 100% nerves, because we thought we could get this really, really wrong. And so when we took that, you know, what we took was the characters and the world and then brought it into an interactive environment. Again, I'm answering by saying what the what is, not the how. The how was complicated, but I suppose it's different for every project.
What's the hardest part about giving a player a character a personality and the body shape? That
Building the character. The
Yeah.
hardest part about building a character.
I mean, I think the hardest part is trying to ensure that, I mean, it's sort of the same question you answered, that there's room for the player to feel like they can identify with this person and that they can share their psychology, if you want, with this character. So, and as she said, there are different approaches. You know, in a first-person game, you may back way off and give the player a lot of room to fill that in. And in a third-person game, you know, with Ezio or Sam Fisher or something, you might have a very strongly defined character. But again, a lot of it is about just trying to make the character what that character represents and what, you know, what he or she looks like, the way he or she moves, identifiable with, something that your targeted audience can bond to, because they're going to be spending a lot of time attached to that person. So.
Or that they aspire to.
Right.
Yeah.
And I find they sort of grow. You know, if you come up with a character and you're living with that character inside your head, you start to think, I think they've got dark hair. They've got short dark hair. They're 6 foot something or other. You know, they come to life, and you start to imagine it.
I like to find how they speak first. If I can hear the character, then I can see the character.
Yeah.
Why don't we so many questions.
This one's for Clint. So with Sam Fisher, obviously he's a character that's been established before. How do you rewrite a story with his prerequisites and try and evolve that into a new story?
I mean, so to be clear, I worked on like the first Splinter Cell and then the third one, so I haven't worked on any of the more recent ones. It's been like almost 10 years since I worked on that. But, you know, we did have to, you know, going from Splinter Cell 1 to Splinter Cell 3, and there was another studio making Splinter Cell 2 in between. There was a lot of evolution in the character, and a lot of shifting emphasis on his personality and some of the things like that. I was lucky because I had a tremendous amount of freedom, having worked on the first one as a writer, and then going on to the third one, I had a lot of freedom and a lot of trust to just kind of emphasize the things that I wanted to emphasize and push them in the direction that I wanted. So for me, it was very easy. Sam Fisher, like she said, you start to hear him in your head, and he kind of, I spent much too much time with Michael Ironside's voice, like whispering in my ear at night. So he just becomes a part of you and an extension of you as a writer, in the best possible way. Like that's kind of, I think, the perfect case of getting to write a character for a video game, or it was for me anyways. So in your question was, what's the hardest part of it, or?
So how do you sort of have an established storyline and then write new things into it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have an established storyline. I had the established notion that, he's this American, special forces commando dude who, fights information warfare like stuff in foreign countries. But I mean, the story was it wasn't mine. A bunch of us I came up with 4 or 5 versions and talked with the art directors and the other designers and the tech directors, and we talked about different goals for the game and all of that stuff. And then, out of this was the main story that we liked, but we didn't like this part of it, and we didn't like that part of it, and we liked that part from that other story, and is there a way to pull these pieces in together, and like what's the character's story going to be, and how's Sam's journey going to progress, and all of these things. So it was just a very collaborative process, and we all worked really hard to build that. But again, we had a tremendous amount of freedom. I mean, it was I don't know, I guess it was a long time ago.
Why don't we go on the other side of the room?
My question's about social conscience. Given how much influence you have over youth, how much responsibility do you feel for themes around feminism, violence and justice?
I was going to pick up on this actually when we were talking about this, because you were starting to think about ethics, and I think this is a new medium, right? So we're having fun. We're in the play park and we're throwing stuff up and stuff. We're getting to a point now where I think the influence, you see it every day in the press around, people being concerned about the influence of games, and I think it is. It's something I feel every day. And funnily enough, I had a long conversation with this with a writer yesterday about the ethics of what we do, and specifically around gender balance in games. And with the suspect, she was saying, "Why didn't you have? Why was it a man? Why wasn't it a woman?" And I said, "Well, actually, we've got two characters in there. We've got the guy, and then we've got your police sort of handler, and she's a woman." And I thought a lot about it, and I realised that I couldn't. If I'd cast that as a woman, it wouldn't have worked in the same sort of malevolent way that I wanted it to do. Which sounds, you've got to say these things because it's true, right? But the female character of the police woman is very much more trustworthy. It twists at the end. But, so in fact, anyone who's going, women can be really malevolent, I know, we're putting that at the end of the story, that's the twist. So don't worry, it's all fair.
Getting yourself into a bit of trouble over here.
I think I dug myself out of it. But I think coming back to it, those role of ethics, as we're starting to talk about, if you're setting a game in a war zone, there's so much stuff going on in the world at the moment. You have to be responsible. You can't trivialize it because people will be influenced by it. And as we said, if you're in this intensity of the dialogue with someone, they will be drawn into forming beliefs on the products that you put out there. And again, just one of the ones that we felt on the suspect, we've very pleased to have some funding from Screen Australia for that project, and one of the comments they fed back was, are you morally taking people down the wrong path in this conversation? Are you actually going to be getting people to empathise with this guy and not pull him back out again? And I suppose we'd gone halfway down that pathway, but when they mentioned that, then we said, okay, we've got to pull the user right out of this rabbit hole and bring them back into a place where they're standing in their confidence. So I think it's a massive question, and I think it's incumbent on us to take it very seriously as people who are telling these stories. I don't know.
I would want to add one thing, though. I think that we actually have, I feel, two really important sort of, for lack of a better way to put it, ethical responsibilities. One is obviously to handle our subject matter in a mature way and recognize that people in our audience are consuming this culture and this content and what that means. But I think we also have an ethical responsibility of stewardship over the future of the entire medium, which means we have to always balance the idea of like, okay, are we able to talk about slavery or you know, gender balance issues or whatever in this game in a way that is sophisticated enough that it's fair to talk about that. And the other thing in the balance is like, we actually have to try and we have to be allowed to fail. Because if we don't, it's just very, very easy to just sterilize everything and be like, oh, well, you can't make a game set in Africa. You can't make a game where U.S. soldiers are at war with, you know, people in that part of the world because those issues are too serious. We should just be fighting spacemen because that's harmless and safe, right? That's not responsible stewardship of the future of an entire cultural medium. And I think we have to tackle that problem head on and not hide from it.
We've got time for a couple more. Let's grab this gentleman here in the black shirt.
Yay! Jill, I'll address you directly. So, Assassin's Creed Liberation scored a lot of things. Can we make games about slavery? Can we do this? Can we do that? In the same way that Spec Ops: The Line, question, well, you commit a war crime, you're a bad guy. Like, does it excite you as a writer to take on these things that are going to be polarizing because they're interesting or because they're serious topics, or are you guys afraid of that? Because there's a lot of criticism that says like, another Call of Duty, like everyone's afraid to write something interesting, kind of thing. Like, so yeah, does it excite you as a writer to do polarizing stuff?
Yeah, I get myself attached to these projects on purpose. I make great efforts to clear space in my schedule and get myself to where I need to be. If I see something that's interesting and I feel like, yes, I know how to do that. I know what I want to do with it. I don't want any, I get, with like Freedom Cry, I was like, oh, we're gonna actually do a game about systemic slavery. Like, I don't want someone else getting on it. Instead of me, it needs to be me. So yeah, I find it easier when I'm very driven or inspired or when I really care about the subject matter. So yeah, no fear.
Let's go, we haven't been all the way over here. I'm going to make you walk over there if that's okay.
Hi guys, how you going? We've seen, I think, a lot more collaboration. I mean, you guys have been talking about it from within the development teams and stuff, but I think there's been a lot more collaboration between the gamers themselves and developers over the last few years. And I'm sort of thinking about indie games in particular now with the rise of Kickstarter and that sort of stuff. But we've also seen some really interesting things like what happened with Mass Effect, where there was this big outcry about, oh, we don't like the ending, you have to change it. And that happened and the developers sort of bent over and changed it for the gamers. Do you think we've crossed a boundary there? I mean, should we be going down that murky path? I mean, how do you guys as writers feel about that?
I'd mentioned, response to user feedback. I think there is a real value in listening to the community, in your community and your players, and some great ideas come from there. You mentioned Kickstarter. Hey, it's a crowdsourced thing, but the vision needs to stay the same. So I think I would say if we've got a particular narrative and a story that's happening for a reason, I'm not going to deviate, like the twist I was talking about at the end of our thing. I'm not going to change that because we get people saying I don't like it. Like, if you don't like it, don't play it. It's your choice, There's still this vision that I think we need to hold true to.
Let's go back down there. We've got a lot of hands up here in the front row.
Go with the Fez. Got a kudos for the Fez.
Fez hat. Good hat.
Great hat.
How do you deal with writer's block? Or do you get that much?
I like this question. You're not going to like the answer. One of my earliest writing teachers liked to say that writer's block is just a failure of the ego. And what that means in English is just that you don't have writer's block. What you have is a fear that the thing that you could be writing right now isn't good enough, or else you're just not interested in putting in the time to write a bunch of boring stuff until the really interesting stuff starts to come out. I'm a big believer that writing is rewriting, and that ideas come to you because you're working. You don't wait for the idea and then go to work. You sit down and work, and then while you're at your desk, that's when the ideas come in. So I just think you just deal with writer's block by just writing straight through it, even if it means just picking up a pencil and writing down what you had for lunch to get at least the kinetic energy of writing moving.
Why don't we go up there? We haven't been up there yet.
This will most likely be directed to the Sherlock guy, but everybody else has probably come across this in the past. When you have a team of writers, as a writer personally, I find myself conflicted when people try to put their own opinions onto mine. How do you kind of coalesce all that stuff together? Like, how do you get one idea from a guy put into another idea from another guy and make them work?
I'll take this really quickly because I think it's more pertinent to the other guys. Other than it's the collaboration thing, and it's about communication between writers. I mean, my dad's a writer. He works on his own, or he works in teams of 10, 15 people sometimes, all collaborating on ideas. And there is the sense of working towards a particular project where, I don't know, you're sort of riffing on it rather than working in isolation. And as I said on The Suspect, on the new one, there are three different types of writers. One is a more conceptual, who's coming up with the worlds and the characters, and then it's a technical one, and then it's me, who sort of fits in the middle. I don't know what my role is, but I don't know what you think. So it's collaboration, I think, is the key.
I've noticed some writers have a tendency to feel guilty if they're not coming up with every idea personally, and the way to deal with that is just to flip the switch in your mind and instead be of the mind of yay, free ideas from other people. And then yes, I can cheat. And that actually makes everybody get along better, and it makes people feel good when you use their ideas, not when you steal their ideas, but when you collaboratively use their ideas. I just think the best way to build team rapport is to say yes, that thing you just said, I'm gonna expand on it.
Yeah, I think also in game writing, what I got used to very quickly as a writer was, in game development as a whole, you spend most of your time dealing with functional problems. We can't do this because it doesn't work. We can't do this because we can't load those textures because the memory's full. We can't do this because there's no animation for the right-hand side of that movement. We can't do this because he needs to have the gun in his hand here. And so you're constantly dealing with, we can't do X or Y because of Z. And so that creeps into the whole writing. I have this idea where I was but we can't do it. It's great, your idea is great. It's never gonna ship because we can't do it because of this or this or this. And you just internalize that whole, I need to find functional solutions to this, and it kind of overhauls your writing process and makes you much better at just okay, I need to find a local solution to how to get this line of dialogue out, even though I can't, have him put the gun in the other hand because it's impossible. So you just get forced into a solution mode that allows you to get through that problem, I think.
And then very occasionally it also means that sometimes you can solve a writing problem by simply getting the animation director to talk to the technical director.
Right.
And just try to eliminate as many can'ts as possible.
So we've got two more questions. So I think we'll pick this gentleman up here in the red, and then I think we'll go this gentleman down here with the beard.
This one's for Clint. So you were saying before with Far Cry 2 that there's a balance between, treating the seriousness of the situation with respect and gameplay, making it entertainment for players. Where do you draw that line between making something entertaining and trying to keep the seriousness? Because you're saying it can't be fun for us to go blow around Africans' heads off with rifles, but it still has to be to a point to make it interesting enough for people to want to play the game.
Good question. So for me, I just try not to use the word fun. I think that fun is just a really overloaded, confused concept that doesn't make any sense. It's like if we had to say, Saving Private Ryan isn't a very good movie because it's not very fun. That doesn't make sense, right? It's a complete non sequitur. Fun is just like chess also isn't particularly fun, or at least fun is not a word I would reach for to describe chess. It is the most successful game ever created by the human species, right? So fun is just this really complicated word that I try not to use. So when I think about Far Cry and making the game, words I like to use are engaging. Like, am I engaged by what's happening? Do I have agency in the combat? Do I feel like the decisions that I'm making in the moment-to-moment combat are meaningful and are reflecting back the themes of the game to me? So if I get in a gunfight with some enemies and then the grass catches on fire and there are wounded guys lying in a burning field, like, is the feedback coming back to me that this is like really horrible, that fire's being blown by the wind and those wounded guys over there are going to burn to death? Like, that's pretty terrifying and horrible. It's not fun, but it is engaging. It's reinforcing your sense of agency. It's connecting you to the themes of the game. It's putting you in the conflict that's being simulated. Some people, the public maybe, who don't think about these concepts all the time, will say, yeah, I thought the game was really fun, but like, that's fine that you put it that way, but I can't use that terminology because it doesn't serve the purpose of the work I try to do.
Strong emotions are more important than positive emotions.
Right, sure,
right?
Yeah.
How would you take, what's your preference between a game that does take itself seriously and one that does not take itself seriously at all? How does that impact its value to you? Like, Far Cry 2 and then Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon.
So games are also really, or many games, I should say, are really interesting in that, the concept of suspension of disbelief in film, where you literally kind of lose yourself into the immersion in the film experience, is completely different. When you're playing a game, you are always aware that you are playing the game. That's part of like what a game is that you have this sort of contract with the what we call the ludic contract. You are agreeing consciously to allow yourself to participate in this system that is not real. And so it's a hard thing to do as we try to make games that deal with more serious themes, because in a sense, a word I do try to use as opposed to fun is play. In a sense, you are always playing. So even when you're running around Africa, shooting people with a rusty AK-47 and sick with malaria, you're playing. And that sounds a little bit strange. Like, that doesn't sound like, when we say play, we think of children and we think of all of that stuff. But play is actually much more ancient than that. I don't think when tiger cubs are playing that it's really all that cute. They're practicing eviscerating other animals. Like, they're honing their skills, right? And so one of the things you're playing at in Far Cry 2, for example, or in Assassin's Creed Liberation, is you're playing at the idea of interfacing with these themes, these other realities, and interfacing with them in a real, like a simulated way, but in a real way, not in a 2 or 3 layers removed, through characters and fiction and authorship. You're actually interfacing with what it means to be in these kinds of situations, and you're playing at a kind of understanding and comprehension that you can only get through interactivity. So it is tricky to balance the idea that when a game takes itself too seriously, it's pushing a demand on the player that they perhaps try harder than they normally would to distance themselves from the ludic contract, to go deeper into the ludic contract than they normally would, to subscribe more deeply to a world that they know is not real, and that's a delicate task for sure. And a lot of games, Far Cry Blood Dragon, really like pushing it back in your face and saying, hey, games are allowed to be stupid, and you know what, games are allowed to be stupid, and that's totally okay. And we can have totally stupid, ridiculous stuff, and that's part of part of the breadth of what we can accomplish. So I think it's a question of like what's going to work for the kind of game you're trying to make. Is it going to be stupid and really self-aware and allow the player to be constantly cognizant of the ludic contract, or are you really going to try to ask the player to subscribe deeply to that and go deep? And do you have a design and themes that are going to support that depth of subscription? That was complicated.
Well, I think I'm going to awkwardly check the time again and make sure, but I think we might be, yes, we're out of time. Your questions have been so good, guys. I wish we could do this for another hour. It's been fascinating, and if we could please thank Clint, Jill, and Guy for being here.